Andrew has 40 years experience in this sector, former Origin Energy executive and past director of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Andrew, thanks for your time. How did we get to this sort of situation where, as Trudy reported there, potentially load shedding within the system this evening in Brisbane?
Well, the real issue is that this has been a crisis that's been actually 10 years in the making. We haven't had any real guidance in terms of planning for this industry federally for about a decade, probably because of the climate denialism we've had, or the climate wars. And what that has meant is that coal plants are getting frailer, they're getting older. I mean, they're a decade older than they were 10 years ago. Stating the obvious, they're getting more frail, and today we've got about at least almost a dozen of those plants down on the eastern seaboard, over 5,000 megawatts of capacity. So we've got a lot of coal out, we've got high gas prices because of international factors flowing through to the domestic industry, and we've got a cold spell hitting us when a lot of those coal plants are down. They should normally be up in the winter time and they're not.
So what needs to happen, and can it be done soon enough to prevent large-scale blackouts right in the middle of, as you said, the cold spell?
Well, it's pretty hard. I mean, AEMO's got a certain series of mechanisms they're putting into place. Your previous commentator commented on some of those, and they, in the past, generally have worked, although if it gets to the end point, it may be that some people lose supply, or some big industrials get turned off for a period. Really what we need is some of the things that came out of last week's meeting led by Minister Bowen. So we need a plan for transitioning this industry so that private investment, most of the investment in the industry is the private sector, that investment can be made with confidence. We haven't had that for almost a decade now, other than the renewable energy target that lasted for about 6 or 8 years. So we need some planning certainty. Hopefully that transition plan will have enough detail to give industry the confidence to invest for a system going forward that's fit for purpose. We need a capacity mechanism potentially. We've got to be careful in the way that's designed so that people can't game the market as much as they're doing right now, potentially. And the third thing we need is a reserve store of gas, much like we've got now happening in electricity. We need a reserve store in gas so that when we get to situations where gas is extremely short, the market operator can bring some reserved supplies of gas to the market, ease the pressure.
And do you believe there should be a gas reservation for domestic use like there is in WA? There isn't for the rest of the country.
No, there isn't, although if you do the numbers, there's a fair percentage of gas from Queensland and obviously from Victoria. I mean, all the Victorian gas goes into the domestic market, and most of the gas coming out of South Australia does. But a lot of the gas in Queensland also goes into the domestic market currently. Probably when you add all that up, it's a much higher percentage than the reservation in WA. So I don't think that the reservation by itself would make a difference on the eastern seaboard. Probably what would make a difference are things that would remind the large gas producers in Queensland that, you know, we do have a domestic industry and a domestic consumers, and ultimately their businesses, much like happened in Western Australia, those business expansions for export were supported on the basis of domestic markets for 20, 30, 40 years of sales of gas. So here's an industry that where the domestic sector really supported the growth of that industry for several decades, and perhaps they need reminding that those domestic customers need to be looked after at times like this, rather than just chase the last spot LNG cargo offshore. Sorry.
Yeah, no, totally fair point. I think that'd be nice to have that corporate memory and, you know, as part of their sort of social license. But explain to me, why did energy companies not act on this? I take your point about the lack of clarity in a federal sense, but all the states have been very much forward-leaning in terms of their systems. I know the Perrottet government, a Berejiklian government with its renewable energy zones and so on. The states have been forward-leaning. Shouldn't the energy companies also have realised this is where it's going, even if the federal government didn't at the time?
Well, I think some of them have, and there have been a number of projects that renewable projects and to a lesser extent storage projects that have gone ahead on the basis of state mandates for renewables. So if we look at energy pricing, or more particularly electricity pricing across the eastern seaboard, you know, it wasn't that many years ago, for example, that South Australia saw some of the highest wholesale prices in the electricity market. Well, today they're some of the lowest, quarter on quarter. And that is in part because there's been a bipartisan approach to expanding out renewables in storage in that state. Victoria is following, so today, well, these days, Victoria will typically see lower prices than you'd see in New South Wales and Queensland. And I guess while New South Wales and Queensland have taken some initiatives, these things, you know, don't happen overnight when you're spending billions of dollars building new power plants, be they gas or renewable. They take time. So we've heard, you know, in the last week that the timetable for Snowy 2 is blown out by, you know, a couple of years. Large gas turbine plants that are being built, for example, like Kurri Kurri, I mean, those things take a couple of years at least to build because most of the equipment comes from overseas. And likewise with wind turbines. So these things take a while. Policy needs to be put in place. Then industry can respond. But we're talking, you know, probably 2, 3, 4 years out before we see from the get-go the outcomes of that with plant on the ground making a difference to capacity. And I guess, Kieran, where it's really important is, and for goodness sake, we should have learnt this after, you know, what happened in Victoria and South Australia with coal plants shutting down and exiting the system. But what we've got to do and must do is bring that renewable capacity and storage online before coal plants fail. And unfortunately, because we've had paralysis at the federal level, what we're doing is we're now seeing the actuality of coal plants failing, and we haven't, unfortunately, in some of those other states, seen the renewable capacity be added as it should have been in time.
Andrew Stock, I very much appreciate your insights and your time today. Thank you for that.
Thanks very much, Kieran.